Materials supplied by Microsoft Corporation may be used for internal review, analysis, or research only. Any editing, reproduction, publication, rebroadcast, public showing, internet, or public display is forbidden and may violate copyright law.
I think we're good to go.
Okay.
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I have a feeling there are a number of you watching on the internet today, so welcome as well. I have the good fortune of introducing and spending a few minutes interviewing Fred Vogelstein, who's our guest today, and we're going to get into the book that he's written. Some of you have already purchased. Oh, okay. Fred is, as you may know, a contributing editor at Wired Magazine, where he writes about the world of high-tech business and finance. His writing has appeared in Fortune, the New York Times Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, U.S. News and World Report, and elsewhere, but he certainly is probably best known for his writings with Wired. So we met a couple years ago and just by happenstance reconnected in the last few weeks since I saw the book and was very intrigued by it. I think as good a place as any, since obviously many of the people, since you're just buying the book, have not had a chance to read it, is to provide kind of an overview of the book and as much why you decided to invest 2 years of your life focused on this, interviewing dozens of people, and a fascinating read. I have had the good fortune of reading it.
Well, I think the answer to the question is because I have a death wish. Writing a book is hard. But the reason I wanted to do it was because I'd written a couple of stories for Wired, and what I came to understand, I'd written a couple of stories for Wired about the iPhone and the early days of sort of some of the competition that was going on between Apple and Google. And what I came to understand was that this really wasn't just a fight between two tech companies, but that this was a fight that was going to spill over into a bunch of different industries, that it was going to really change, that it was a fight that had the potential to be as big as the internet browser, as big as the PC, as big as the integrated circuit, and arguably maybe bigger than all of those. And so I know that in Silicon Valley, the word revolution is used liberally. And so I wanted to spend some time thinking about whether or not this was indeed actually going to be happening. But what I ultimately concluded was that these devices that we carry around in our pockets now and take for granted really are changing the world in fundamental ways. And what I came to realize is that they're not just changing the world of technology, that they're essentially changing the world of media, that basically the kind of convergence that many people have been thinking and talking about in the world of tech for 30 years, and many people have been thinking and talking about and losing money over in the world of tech and media for years, was actually starting to happen. That in fact, the debate about whether or not whether or not the PC was going to be the dominant device in the house or the TV was going to be the dominant device in the house, that it turned out that it actually was going to be neither of those. That actually there was going to be these devices that fit in our pocket. Because ultimately, when you stop and think about it, it's like you can watch TV on these things. And that sounds like it's belittling them to kind of talk about it like that. But ultimately, that's kind of that's how powerful these devices are. I mean, I found, one of the things that's kind of remarkable is to think a little bit about what Netflix has done with House of Cards, for example. Netflix is a technology company, and yet, as a result of these devices controlled by Google and Apple in our pockets, it was able to go out and produce an Emmy Award-winning series called House of Cards and distribute it outside the broadcast system, outside the cable system, and have it become something of an enormous hit. And so I guess I thought that we were on the verge of some enormous shifts in the way we not only think about technology, but media as well. And that seemed like a bigger than a magazine piece.
Why, natural question sitting here at One Microsoft Way, why only Apple and Google? And why those two?
I thought this was sort of a central question that I had to answer actually before I embarked on this project, because one of the things you think about when you think about platforms and change in the world of technology is that there are lots of different companies doing lots of different things. So there's Apple and Google, but then there's also Amazon, there's Microsoft, there's Facebook, there's Netflix, there's Twitter, and you could even go down the list into things like Square and maybe Snapchat. What I ultimately concluded was what made Apple and Google, would put Apple and Google on a slightly higher plane than everybody else, was that ultimately they controlled the devices in one way or another. So they control the eyeballs. So the majority of smartphones being sold today are either sold by Apple or sold by companies that, like Samsung and HTC and Motorola, that all run the Android operating system. And so what I ultimately concluded was that as a result of controlling those endpoints, that put them in a particularly special and important place vis-a-vis everybody else. I'll give you a for instance about sort of the power that these platforms create. In 2010, many of you will probably remember that Apple announced a new version of iOS and that had Twitter deeply integrated into it. You could do some things with Twitter that you couldn't do with any other application because they were deeply embedded into the operating system on the phone. Well, the question that everybody asked at that moment was, well, what happened to Facebook? Why wasn't Facebook there? Well, the answer to that story is because when Facebook and Apple were negotiating a deal to be on the phone, Facebook tried to negotiate with Apple the way any business in that situation would negotiate. And Apple didn't really like Facebook's terms. And so it just simply turned and did the deal with Twitter. And so when Facebook then did appear on the iPhone a year or two later, I know from doing reporting from the book, the terms were much more favorable to Apple than they had been. And so it's that kind of power implied. It's that kind of power that prompted me to kind of focus on those two. And obviously, it's something that people around here understand intuitively, the power of platform economics.
So you interviewed, what was the number of past and present Apple and Google?
I think if you add it up, it probably winds up being about 100, over 100.
Of just those two companies.
Yeah, of just those two companies. And one of the things that I really tried to do with the book, which I have not done as aggressively with some of my magazine pieces, is it was really important for me, in order to make the story work, to actually get people on the record talking about their experiences. So one of the things you'll notice in the book, or at least people have noticed for me, is that there are about a dozen people from Apple and Google on the record talking about their experiences working on the iPhone and the Android project. Now, as you guys will not be surprised to learn, the Apple people no longer work at Apple, but since they were the people who were primarily responsible for getting the project off the ground while they were at Apple, it seemed reasonable to talk to them regardless of, to include them regardless as to where they were. But the point was that I really wanted to give people a feeling not just about what was happening, but sort of the how. You know, for example, you know, we all talk and think a lot about how we all look at each other's devices, we all look at what we have done, and we, you know, people here look at Apple and Google's dog and pony shows, and people at Google and Apple look at Microsoft's dog and pony shows whenever they roll out a new product. And it is tempting for all of us to kind of believe the sales pitch that is presented to us, that essentially goes like this. We came up with this idea here, and it wound up with this product here. Draw a straight line. Well, what I wanted to try to do in the book is convey to people that it doesn't work like that at all. That the way Silicon Valley really works and the way that products get built that change the world is incredibly messy. And so, I mean, so messy, for example, that the people who were, I talked to one of the engineers a lot who helped put together the iPhone for Apple, and was in charge of a lot of the radios that in the first iPhone. And he tells a story about being so nervous when Steve Jobs was demoing the phone that he and his team were sitting in the fifth row doing shots of whiskey because they were so convinced that the demo was going to collapse. And so I wanted to give people an understanding of how things really worked.
Hard as it is to put aside a couple of individuals, the late Steve Jobs for one, and leadership at Google, how, as you made your way through the 2 years of all these interviews, what was your impression of the differences in the way these two companies approached this whole topic that you have? I mean, I certainly have an impression from reading it, but you know, I'm just reading the final book. What was your impression as to kind of how they each approached this and strategizing, and how much was forward thinking versus reactive, et cetera, as they went through this?
Well, I think what's really interesting is that they started essentially here, and they're much closer in terms of how they're approaching things than they were when they started. So Apple is a company full of incredible engineers, but the most powerful people at Apple are not engineers. They're marketers and designers. I mean, Johnny Ive is the most powerful, arguably the most powerful person at Apple besides Tim Cook. And, you know, he's a product designer. Whereas at Google, the guys who run the show most definitely are the engineers. At Google, Larry and in fact, at Google, until I want to say 4 years ago, getting a job in marketing at Google was arguably one of the worst jobs you could have in Silicon Valley. I mean, Larry and Sergey actually, when they were starting the company in the early days, they had some of the best marketers on the planet like draw up an enormous advertising campaign. I think Sergio Zyman was the guy who was famous, I guess maybe for, well, I don't want to say he was famous for New Coke, but he was a very well-known ad person. They spent $1 zillion drawing up a marketing plan for Larry and Sergey to get Google off the ground. And Larry and Sergey looked at it and said, what do we need marketing for? We have the internet. And so, but the point is that, so both of them kind of went at the phone project from very different points of view. Apple from sort of a design perspective, Google sort of from an engineering perspective. But what's interesting is as the years have gone on and as the competition has gotten more and more ferocious, what you'll notice, and this is especially true of Google, less so of Apple, is that Google is becoming actually much more and more Apple-like in the way it sort of actually thinks about the stuff that it produces. So Android initially started out as the free software that was going to be distributed to all the phone manufacturers that were then going to kind of do whatever they needed to do to kind of make great phones, and Google would just sit back and let it all happen. Well, what they came to understand was that having that kind of hands-off attitude was actually getting in their way. That when you have less than 10% of the people running on the most recent version of the software and developers squawking that that the software that they write for one phone doesn't work on another phone, you realize that you have to kind of exert a lot more control over it. And so what you're actually seeing is, with Google, is they're becoming much more Apple-like in the way they're thinking. But the answer is when you boil it down, you've got the best marketers in the planet over here and the best engineers in the planet over here, and that tells you a lot about how both companies approach what they're doing.
You obviously started 2 years ago or whatever, approximately 2 years ago, without the benefit of the deep knowledge that you got out of the research and the interviews, but I would assume you had some impressions about various things, and some changed as you became more educated and informed. Any surprises as you made your way through? I mean, that were kind of like, wow, I never kind of thought that until I really got into this. Were there any things that that kind of took you by surprise?
Yes. What took me by surprise was just how incredibly hard it is to do what you guys do, and it is to do what Apple and Google do every single day. That creating products that actually change the world is not just a job, it's actually kind of a quest. And that it's not a straight line by any stretch of the imagination. You know, you hear people in Silicon Valley, and when I talk about Silicon Valley, I include everything that goes on here as well. You hear them sort of talk about the freedom to fail. But you really don't start to understand what that means until you start to dig into the creation of products like this. The amount of failure that went on in the process of getting to success was absolutely enormous. I mean, one of the things that I lay out in the book is, you know, we all remember when the iPhone first came out. It looked amazing, like you wanted to buy one right then and there, and you know, Steve Jobs was all over the airwaves talking about the revolution that he had started, et cetera, et cetera. The reality was very different than that. The phone that he was showing off, that he actually showed to the world, was a prototype, and actually kind of a lousy prototype at that. The phone was due to be released in 6 months, but when Steve Jobs was showing it to the world, they hadn't set up a manufacturing line. There were only about 100 prototypes that existed at that point. They didn't know how to make them in volume. 6 weeks prior to the announcement, Steve Jobs had said that the front of the phone would be, that the touchscreen would be glass instead of plastic. And so there was a bunch of engineers trying to figure out how to actually make that happen. And the phone, the internals of the phone were full of bugs. And so one of the things that bugs big enough so that in order to make sure the Wi-Fi worked, they actually connected antenna wire to the Wi-Fi antenna inside the phone and then physically ran it off stage. Because the problem is that all of Steve Jobs' demos were live. So one of the things that made him so captivating to watch was the fact that his demos were live. But if you were actually one of the engineers putting one of those demos together, it was a source of anxiety.
Actually, I think I read it in your book, or I read it recently, about how they opted to use a Wi-Fi. They tricked the system into believing it was in Japan. And
yes.
In order to avoid the others in the room
yes.
interfering with it, which was
so it turns out that there is an extra frequency there's an extra Wi-Fi frequency that exists in Japan that doesn't exist in the United States. And so the engineers who were, in addition to sort of jerry-rigging making the Wi-Fi antenna larger, they also made the phone operate as if it were in Japan. And I said to Andy, like, why did you do that? Because this is the engineer I was talking to, and he said, you have an audience with 5,000 nerds. Even if you hide it, they're going to find it. You had to figure out a way to keep them off the network. Otherwise, they were going to wreck the whole demo. They did other things like so the phone, the baseband that actually drove the phone was so full of bugs that they actually hard-coded it so that it always showed 5 bars, so that when everybody was watching Steve Jobs do the demo and they had the big phone up on the screen, it always showed AT&T in 5 bars, which is what everybody would have essentially expected. That was all completely hard-coded, because what they knew was that the baseband would actually work for most of the time that Steve Jobs was showing off the phone. And then it would probably work when he actually went to make a phone call, which would last 30 seconds or 15 seconds. But that during the 90-minute period, the baseband would probably crash half a dozen times. And so they didn't want the audience watching Steve Jobs do the demo watch the bars go down from 5 all the way down to 0 and then back up again. So what I'm trying to say is that, all of this is fun, but the reason I included it all is because to give people an understanding of just how hard it is to do that, and just how much work and dedication it takes to make all this stuff turn out the way it turns out.
So you wind your way as you get toward the end of the book, talking about the media revolution, and it isn't just for those of you who haven't read it, it is not just about the phone fight. How do you see them connecting? What is kind of in the offing? It certainly isn't a finished chapter in any of our businesses today. How do you see the two connecting?
Well, the reason I wrote the book was twofold. One, to kind of give people an understanding as to what it took to build this stuff, but where I see it go, but to give also people a sense of where I think it's going. And where I think it's going is that these is essentially that Apple and Google and maybe a couple of other companies, but let's just take Apple and Google for the moment. They're in the process of creating 21st century television networks. That sounds really sort of far-fetched to a lot of people. It's kind of counterintuitive because the idea of, Google or Apple or Microsoft or any of the companies in Silicon Valley producing like an episode of Breaking Bad or Mad Men or whatever you want, whatever your poison is, or pleasure. On the other hand, when you go back and look at the evolution of television, when you go back and you look at the evolution of Hollywood, where they ultimately started is where Apple and Google are right now, which is controlling distribution and having more money than anybody else. So Apple and Google, between them, have $200 billion. Well, to put that in perspective, the market cap of all of Hollywood is about $400 billion. Now, there are lots of things that people care about in the content industry, but ultimately, when you really kind of boil it down, what they care about is how much are they going to get paid and how many people are going to see their stuff. Well, Apple and Google are in a position to kind of solve both of those equations. And it's not just because they have money and they control the endpoints with their phones, but Google has YouTube, Apple has iTunes. They have distribution mechanisms that are already set up that will enable them to push content out to people in ways that I think we're only just beginning to get our heads around. But I think Google has spent what, $300 million financing content on YouTube, and it's not just the two of them, right? I mean, Amazon is doing it, Microsoft is doing it. I mean, everybody is looking at everybody, I believe, looked at what Netflix was able to do and said, well, I can do that too.
And then I'm going to turn it over, start thinking about questions you might have. Certainly want to open it up to you. Any gut as to what the much quoted Jobs comment to Isaacson about television and all, after having done all this? I realize you didn't really delve into that topic per se, but any gut, or do you?
Well, I can tell you what I think they should do. Whether or not they're going to do it is an entirely different conversation.
What's the should?
I mean, I think they should do a couple of things. I don't know whether or not Apple is going to make a TV or not. But I know that one of the biggest problems that we all face right now in the TV world is that the content that we all watch has become incredibly fragmented. So there are movies that you can watch on Comcast and as well as sports, but then there's also stuff that you can watch with Roku boxes and Apple TV boxes, and then there's stuff that you can download from Amazon, and the number of places where we can all get content is sort of exploding. And as a consumer, that's actually kind of making it frustrating. So whenever my kids and I try to sit down and watch a movie, we always have a moment where I'm going, well, we're paying for Netflix, so we got to try to find it on Netflix first. And then you do the search for Netflix, you don't find it, and then you go to either iTunes or Amazon and download it. Well, Apple could just fix this by starting to buy big chunks of content. I mean, Apple could spend $1 billion a year, not even miss it, and become the biggest repository for content out of all the companies out there. So sometimes I think, so I'm not even sure the answer for them is technological. I mean, a TV would be nice, but the thing about a TV is that we don't replace them as much as we replace our phones or our tablets. And so I find myself scratching my head about whether or not that actually making the TV itself would be the right solution, and whether or not the better solution wouldn't be to simply come up with a better Apple TV box that connected to the existing hardware that we already had. But I don't know whether or not they're going to do it.
Well, certainly you spent a fair amount of time on the challenges of doing the deal with AT&T. It may be that they've gotten into this just like they did with AT&T and discovered that was just one company as opposed to dozens in an entire industry too.
Right.
Questions while your microphone's being, how did you get so many people to talk to you? I mean, that's a lot of people to...
I asked them. That's the glib answer. The real answer is that I did something that I violated the cardinal rule of journalism that no journalist should ever do ever, which is that I agreed to talk to all the people in the book on a background basis before. I agreed to talk to all the people I quote in the book on a background basis. And then when the book was written, I went back to them and told them how they appeared in the book and asked to be able to use their name. This is not for the faint of heart. I can tell you that there were some people who insisted on being anonymous that I was hoping that I really wanted to be on the record. Thankfully, because of the way life works, there were some people I was convinced would demand to be anonymous who agreed to be on the record. But it was really that simple. What I was ultimately hoping, what I knew, the only reason I did it was because I thought it was the only way I could actually get that many people on the record in the book. Human nature is kind of is unpredictable, but one of the things that you do know about people is nobody's going to say, we all move around in the tech industry too much. Nobody's going to say to a journalist 2 years before his book comes out, oh, sure, I'll talk to you on the record and tell you everything you want to know, and then you can use it any way you want in something that you put together 2 years down the road. I've been doing this a long time. I was certain that nobody would agree to do that. What I also suspected, however, was that this was a story that a lot of people wanted to have told. That people at Apple, people at Google killed themselves to build these things and spent a lot of time watching all the people at the top get all the credit for this. And now that time has gone by and the products that they worked on had changed the world, I kind of thought that some of them would actually want people to know what they went through to actually create these things. I turned out to be righter than I thought I was going to be, but so that's kind of, that's kind of the story behind it. I don't ever want to do it like that again. I can tell you that.
Anybody from this room that'd like to? I don't think we can do any. I don't think it's dialed in. But anybody have any questions they want to pose?
Right. Should we be looking at Twitter now?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
There's been a lot of speculation about Apple, especially the Jobs book, about him creating the great big thing, whatever the next thing is for television. Do you have any idea from just talking to everybody what you think that might be?
No. I wish I did.
Actually,
Nobody laid out the roadmap
just
for you.
repeat the question.
Sorry.
Yeah,
the question was, do I have any idea what the next really killer product from Apple is going to be? If it's a TV, what's it going to look like? The short answer is no. What I can say is that I am worried about Apple as a company without Steve Jobs running it. I mean, it's obviously not going to go away anytime soon. I mean, it's got more money than God. And it has, I mean, actually, if you were to take the money, if you were to take Apple's just cash, you could probably turn it into the biggest bank in the world. But so the company isn't going to go away. But one of the things that I came to really understand as a result of doing the book is that in order to make products that change the world, you really have to have somebody in charge who has the ability and authority to bet the entire company's future on the products that they're throwing out there on changing the world. So the iPhone would not have gotten off the ground if Steve Jobs hadn't bet all of Apple's future on the product. I mean, he pulled his best engineers away from other projects so that if the iPhone had failed, not only would Apple have not actually had a killer product, but they wouldn't have had anything in the pipeline for years. And so I guess I'm worried that even though Tim Cook is a wonderful executive and Johnny Ive is one of the best designers in the world, that nobody but a founder has that kind of authority to make those kinds of, to take those kinds of risks.
Street's much more tolerant, too. The investment community tends to be much more tolerant. Rupert Murdoch is able to do things as the essential founder of News Corp that
yes.
hired executives rarely can do.
Well, I mean, Jeff Bezos is a perfect example at Amazon, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Jeff Bezos can look at Wall Street and say, I'm not going to make Amazon's not going to make any money for the next 5 years, but you'll keep investing because you believe that the money that I'm investing in R&D will pay off after that. Nobody else can make that claim.
Over here.
In the rise of Google and as it relates to smartphones, did you learn anything about how the decision was made to acquire Android? And then along the same lines, do you know any of like the scoop about why they acquired Motorola?
Just a quick repeat.
Yeah, sure. So the question was how and why Google acquired Android, and then the second question was about Motorola, similar. The answer to the first question is that Google acquired Android in 2005 because Larry Page knew that the mobile phone was going to become one of the most important devices, knew that the smartphone was going to become one of the most important devices in all of technology, and he believed that Andy Rubin was the smartest guy in the world, in that world. Android really didn't exist in any meaningful way when Google acquired it. But what they did know is that, most of you guys know the history here, probably know the history of the Sidekick that Andy Rubin built when he started Danger. Well, the thing about the Sidekick is that even though it didn't have the marketing budget behind it, it was the first phone that had a full functioning internet browser. So all the internet browsers up until then and actually after then were all using WAP or some other kind of protocol that hampered their ability to function normally, the way a normal desktop web browser did. The Sidekick had a fully functioning internet browser, and actually Larry Page and Sergey Brin were one of the first real users of the Sidekick. And so they had been thinking about this for a while. The question about Motorola is, I think, much more straightforward, which is that, yes, I think Google bought Motorola for the patents, but it's obvious that Google bought Motorola for other reasons besides patents, which is that it allows it to make its own phones. And that gives it some control over the evolution of the Android ecosystem that it previously didn't have.
Gentleman back here.
Disappointed to see there's no photos in your book, because I'd really like to hear your analysis of that famous photo of the meeting between Steve Jobs and Eric Schmidt out in front of the coffee shop.
Yes, it was staged.
Describe the photo a little bit too.
Yes, it was. Okay, sorry. So the question was wishing that there were photos in the book, and specifically the photo of Eric Schmidt and Steve Jobs outside the coffee shop in Palo Alto. I wish there were photos in the book too. We actually tried very hard to get photos in the book. I actually purchased some photos myself to make sure we could get them in the book. And because of production reasons that I'm not even sure I can explain, we had to kill it at the last minute. The picture about Eric Schmidt and Steve Jobs in the coffee shop was staged. They were trying to make sure that people didn't think that Apple and Google were fighting as ferociously as they were. You know, one of the things that people forget is that even though Apple and Google were fighting ferociously, they really needed each other too for a long time. So, you know, even though Steve Jobs went bananas the first time he saw the video of Android in 2007 and threatened Google with lawsuits even then, he didn't have as much clout in 2007 as he did in 2009, certainly at the end of 2009, because in 2007, Steve Jobs wasn't going to be able to sell the iPhone without Google Search, without Google Maps, and without YouTube on it. And so there were some business reasons as well as personal ones that were getting in the way there. Go ahead.
With all your research about Google and Apple and their market share for the phones, do you think Microsoft will stand a chance to enter this, to continue in our competition in this market? What did it take for Microsoft to catch up, or if there's a chance?
So the question is, what will it take for Microsoft to catch up in the smartphone race? I don't know. I think the short answer is that Microsoft how do I put this? What's going on right now between Google and Apple is essentially a platform war. And the history of platform wars in the world of high tech is that it tends to be a winner-take-all game. You know, you guys taught the world that, you know, with Windows and Office. eBay, but there are lots of other examples too. So eBay, there were lots of auction companies out there before eBay completely took over that business. There were lots of, the search advertising business was pretty competitive for a while until Google took that business. And I'm sure people in this room remember Friendster and remember MySpace, but I'm not sure anybody else remembers those social networking companies before Facebook took over that world. I mean, the whole network effect is very powerful. And once it gets going to the point that it is going now, in order for somebody to come in and take it and change the dynamics, what they come in with doesn't have to be as good, has to be, the hurdle is much higher, because in order to get people to switch, the product that Microsoft or any new competitor has to come in with doesn't have to be as good or even a little bit better. It actually has to be like 10 times better to get people to go, oh my gosh, that's so much better, we got to go over there. I think Andy Grove is from Intel, is one of the people that first talked about the power of this. So I don't know. I mean, it's, maybe if Apple's market share continues to fall the way it's falling, that will provide an opportunity. But whatever Microsoft comes in with in the market has really got to wow people. It's got to be perfect right out of the gates.
This gentleman.
In the book, you talked about the strategy of Apple going with the walled garden and looking at a verticalization of its products. And then Google, you were looking at ubiquity in OS. And to kind of vamp on the question prior, maybe not necessarily what would make Microsoft successful in that, but where are the Achilles heels in both of those strategies?
Well, let me repeat the question. So where are the Achilles heels in Google's strategy and Apple's strategy that Microsoft could maybe exploit? The Achilles heel in Apple's strategy is essentially the Achilles heel that was in its strategy with the Macintosh. And the world is a much different place today. So in the 1980s, the biggest buyers for PCs were corporations, so who didn't care about things like ease of use and industrial design. Today, the biggest buyer for phones are obviously consumers who care about that a lot. So, but still, I mean, just looking at Apple's market share numbers, it's pretty clear that the market, even in the United States, is saying that if you have one phone that you're selling and only one phone, that's ultimately going to be harder to compete with somebody who's got a bunch of different phones. I think Google's Achilles heel is the fragmentation issue and the issue of the health of its ecosystem. By that I mean it's whether or not developers can make money making Android apps. So up until the beginning of this year, if you were a developer making Android apps, you did it for the distribution. You didn't do it for the money, because the only money that you had that you could make making mobile apps was making them for the iPhone platform. On top of that, and part of the reason that that was going on was because only 10% of phones were on the current operating system. So if a company like Microsoft wanted to come in and solve either of those problems, it could. I mean, if Microsoft, for example, could come in with a product that enabled developers to make more money and get better distribution. If Microsoft could come in with a product that enabled software developers to get the same distribution that they get on Android, but also make as much money as they make on iOS, that would be and then third, have it be something that was as good or not better a consumer product, that would be a very powerful thing to bring to the market. Go ahead.
You mentioned earlier that a lot of things were messy when they were being developed and built in the Valley in general, and also the Apple and Google. How much of a strategy do people have before they make these massive amounts of investments? I mean, it obviously took a lot of money to develop either of those products. So was there a clear strategy as to where they were going? Or was it just money being invested more in a messy way?
So the question is, did Apple and Google actually have a strategy given how chaotic the process of developing Android and the iPhone were? I think the answer is absolutely that they had a strategy. But I think that I think they knew that they wanted to get from, I think they knew they were here and they knew where they wanted to get to. What they didn't know, but had to simply assume, was that it was going to be, the process was going to be a little bit like this, rather than a straight line. So when they were developing, so for example, if you know something, you have to do a lot of guesswork. So when Apple was designing the iPhone, a lot of the software that it was developing was actually being done on simulators. Why? Because the actual chips that were going to run the iPhone didn't yet exist. When they developed the touchscreen, they knew that multi-touch had been invented, but they also knew that nobody had mass-produced a screen that small for a handheld device. But I guess the answer is that they understood that it was going to be chaotic, but they also understood what the boundaries of that chaos were. So instead of being a straight line from point A to point B, they knew that imagine a rubber ball with imagine sort of two walls and a rubber ball sort of bouncing against the walls. They knew generally what direction it was going to go. They just knew that it was going to be a little bit chaotic in the process.
It was certainly mentioned in the book, but and the litigation was underway in the history of the book, or that you covered. The Samsung factor. I've got another question, but just quickly, what do you think? How does that play into the scheme of things? Because there's certainly, in one sense, Apple is, as you explained, going after the OEMs versus Google and so forth. But beyond just that, Samsung has obviously become a formidable force in the consumer electronics business.
Yeah, and in fact, I actually think Samsung is. I mean, if you want to talk about wild cards in the smartphone world, Samsung is the wild card. Because Samsung can be a formidable competitor to Apple, but it also can be an equally formidable competitor to Google. So the competition with Apple is very straightforward. Do you like the iPhone or do you like the Galaxy? The competition with Google has the potential to be really interesting, because when Android first got started, Samsung needed the Android operating system to get its phone business to sell the phones that it wanted to sell. And it needed to do things the way Google wanted Samsung to do things in order to make that happen. Now, Samsung has half the Android smartphone sales. So that puts it in a very different negotiating position with Google than it was previously. You know, previously the discussion that Samsung and Google would have would be every time Samsung sort of tried to get more flexibility, Google would say, you can do that, it's totally fine, but we might not give you access to the App Store or to Google Maps or to YouTube or all the other things that Samsung would need in order to sell its phone. And in 2010, there wasn't a whole lot that Samsung could say. In 2013 and 2014, Samsung can say back to Google, yeah, maybe that's true, but you know, you guys are an advertising company and you are increasingly reliant on the success of mobile advertising for your business. And since we control half the eyeballs in your mobile advertising business, you would be upset if that went away, wouldn't you? So the pushback is going to, and on top of that, you know, what people forget, although I'm sure Samsung paid very close attention to, was that the assumption until recently was that you couldn't sell a phone without Google Maps and without search and YouTube and things like that. Well, the iPhone 5S, was it the iPhone 5 or the iPhone 5? The iPhone 5. The iPhone 5 kicked Google Maps off, and they kicked YouTube off. And it still sold like hotcakes, even though the Maps product was the subject of one or two stories in the media. So I'm sure that Samsung probably paid very, very close attention to that and thought, So I'm not sure where that's going to go, but it's going to be interesting to watch.
I know some of you are going to have to leave. In case you didn't notice, there are books for sale, $10 in the back, and Fred is nice enough to stay as soon as we wrap in a minute to sign if you'd like it autographed.
You had mentioned earlier that for Microsoft to make inroads in the smartphone market, the product would have to be solid, probably 10 times greater than anything that's out there. Having used Android and iOS, Android certainly isn't 10 times better than iOS, in my opinion anyway. So I'm curious, what was the disruptive force that Android had to get the market share? Was it Google services? Was it being able to sell phones for a penny under contract?
Distribution, basically. So, I mean, essentially they have two different, I mean, essentially what allowed Apple, sorry. So the question was, what was it that allowed Android to kind of get the kind of market share that it did, and over Google, over Apple? Apple and Android have very different distribution models. So Apple makes the operating system and it makes the hardware, and then it sells one phone. Google puts the Android software on hundreds of phones. So Google was able to get enormous market share exactly the same way that Microsoft was able to get enormous market share in the PC business in the 1980s and 1990s over Apple, which was, it's not about the hardware, it's about the software platform. And if you get it on as many different devices as you possibly can, then that gives you the ability to, through the power of platform economics, to drive the conversation about what kind of software and applications run on top of that.
Fred also does a great job explaining the enthusiasm that the carriers had as they watched AT&T at that point with having essentially exclusivity, at least in this country, on the iPhone, and how they really were champing at the bit for and rooting for another player. I mean, it sounds, when you say it, rather intuitive, but when you actually see how it played out, it's in the book anyway. It's interesting. I know we're going to have to wrap here in a second, but I don't know which, maybe, I think you were next.
Actually, my question was dovetailed right in the comment you just made. Can you talk a little bit about the AT&T and Apple kind of, the impact and kind of that kind of negotiations and kind of basically the mobile operator play when Apple was first coming up with this thing?
So the question is, talk about the origins of the AT&T Apple deal. I'm trying to think about how to put this in a sentence or two. Essentially, AT&T, there was sort of a shared need. So AT&T as a result of mergers and I guess AT&T then Singular. At that point, the wireless business was in a fair amount of turmoil, and Singular was watching that turmoil and wondering about its future. And it felt like it needed to do something big to retain and get more customers. And even though the rule book of wireless relationship with manufacturers said that they drove the bus and that the manufacturers just did what they were told, by 2005 or 2006, Steve Jobs was becoming a cultural icon again. So what most people forget is that, the iPod in 2003 and 2004, the iPod in 2003 was not yet a hit. By 2006, it was the biggest thing on the planet. And so AT&T thought about the possibilities of partnering with Steve Jobs on its brand. I mean, they basically said, or Singular, it's hard to keep them straight because it started out as Singular and then it became AT&T. But what Singular basically said was, gosh, we need to kind of take our business from here to here. How do we do that? Well, let's get in bed with Steve Jobs because that will make us look really cool. And that, to be honest, is what allowed them to sort of throw out the rule book. Meanwhile, I think that Steve Jobs was looking at that whole thing and thinking, well, goodness, if AT&T's prepared to let me do my own thing, then maybe I should take this on because, remember, most people forget about the rocker, but Apple had done a deal with Motorola and with Singular to build something called the rocker. Well, the origins of that was that basically Steve Jobs didn't want to do a deal with the carriers because he hated doing business with them, and so this to him seemed like kind of the best way of sort of inoculating himself from having to deal with those guys. Well, it turned out to be a disaster. and it was bad for Apple's brand, and it was bad for really everybody it touched. And so as a result of that failure, he was much more receptive to what AT&T was bringing to him than he probably would have been before.
I actually heard Ralph De La Vega, who runs the cellular business for AT&T, speak about a month ago at a conference in New York. It was a closed door, not press covered. And he described basically the breaking of rules that he did. He'd get calls from his tech team about things going back and forth, and he said it was just a call of he said Jobs called him one day furious about something that came in, and I think it had to do with Radio Stack or something. He said, just disregard it. And he called his people and said, I'm not getting into details, but we're not doing that. And it was they just took an approach of, we're just shutting this down and moving on. It was really quite amazing. And in an organization that size, I suspect it never has happened before. And it was really fascinating to hear a guy that was one of the in the tent early on, probably.
He was like the tent.
Yeah, it was really amazing.
And what people forget is that there were a lot of problems. One of the things that the thing that you have to admire, actually, Ralph, and because I've written stories that he might or might not have liked, he might not give me the opportunity to say this to his face, but you have to admire what Ralph put up with, because it was certainly true that AT&T's network couldn't handle the load that the iPhone put on it. It is also true that the iPhone's first baseband, made by Infineon, was full of bugs, and that if you did an analysis of the phone as a phone, it didn't stack up compared to all the other models. And so you have to give Ralph De La Vega some credit for eating it when Apple and Steve Jobs kept fueling the AT&T fueling the
they're the culprit.
Blaming AT&T, blaming all the problems on AT&T, because it's hard to know whose fault, how much was Apple's fault versus AT&T's fault, but the way it was portrayed was that it was entirely AT&T's fault, and that's not exactly how it turned out.
Well, I don't see any other hands. I want to thank Fred for making the time to come and speak, and appreciate it. And again, any of you in the room that are interested in buying the book, purely if you want to do so, he's going to sign them for you, and have a good afternoon. Thanks.